Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 12th chapter of the third book of Von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, the title being Assembly of Forces in Time. The text follows. We have here to deal with the conception which in real life diffuses many kinds of illusory light. A clear definition and development of the idea is therefore necessary, and we hope to be allowed a short analysis. War is the shock of two opposing forces in collision with each other, from which it follows as a matter of course that the stronger not only destroys the other but carries it forward with it in its movement. This fundamentally admits of no successive action of powers, but makes the simultaneous application of all forces intended for the shock appear as a primordial law of war. So it is in reality, but only so far as the struggle resembles, also in practice, a mechanical shock. That when it consists in a lasting mutual action of destructive forces, then we can certainly imagine a successive action of forces. This is the case in tactics, principally because firearms form the basics of all tactics, but also for other reasons as well. If in a fire combat 1,000 men are opposed to 500, then the gross loss is calculated from the amount of the enemy's force and our own. 1,000 men fire twice as many shots as 500, but more shots will take effect on the 1,000 than on the 500 because it is assumed that they stand in closer order than the other. If we were to oppose the number of hits to be double, then the losses on each side would be equal. From the 500 there would be, for example, 200 disabled, and out of the body of 1,000 likewise the same. Now if the 500 had kept another body of equal number quite out of fire, then both sides would have 800 effective men, but of these, on the one side there would be 500 men quite fresh, fully supplied with ammunition in their full vigor. On the other side, only 800, all alike shaken in their order, in want of sufficient ammunition and weakened in physical force. The assumption that the 1,000 men, merely on account of their greater number, would lose twice as many as 500 would have lost in their place is certainly not correct. Therefore, the greater loss which the side suffers that has placed the half of its force in reserve must be regarded as a disadvantage in the original formation. Further, it must be admitted that in generality of cases, the 1,000 men would have the advantage, at the first commencement, of being able to drive their opponent out of his position and force him to a retrograde movement. Now, whether these two advantages are a counterpoise to the disadvantage of finding ourselves with 800 men, to a certain extent disorganized by the combat, opposed to an enemy who is not materially weaker in the numbers and who has 500 quite fresh troops, is one that cannot be decided by pursuing an analysis further. We must here rely upon experience, and there will scarcely be an officer experienced in war who will not, in the generality of cases, assign the advantage to that side which has the fresh troops. In this way it becomes evident how the employment of too many forces in combat may be disadvantageous, for whatever advantages the superiority may give in the first moment, we may have to pay dearly for the next. But this danger only endures as long as the disorder, the state of confusion and weakness lasts, in a word, up to the crisis which every combat brings with it, even for the conqueror. Within the duration of this relaxed state of exhaustion, the appearance of a proportionate number of fresh troops is decisive. That when this disordering effect of victory stops, and therefore only the moral superiority remains which every victory gives, then it's no longer possible for fresh troops to restore the combat. They would only be carried along in the general movement. A beaten army cannot be brought back to victory a day after by means of a strong reserve. Here we will find ourselves at the source of a highly material difference between tactics and strategy. The tactical results, the results within the four corners of the battle, and before its close, lie for the most part within the limits of that period of disorder and weakness. But the strategic result, that is to say, the result of the total combat, of the victories realized, let them be small or great, lies completely beyond outside of that period. It is only when the results of partial combats have bound themselves together into an independent wall that the strategic result appears, but then the state of crisis is over, the forces have resumed their original form, and are now only weakened to the extent of those actually destroyed. Place hors de combat. The consequence of this difference is that tactics can make continued use of forces, strategy, only a simultaneous one. If I cannot in tactics decide all by first success, if I have to fear the next movement, it follows of itself that I employ only so much of my force for the success of the first moment as appears sufficient for that object, and keep the rest beyond the reach of fire, conflict of any kind, in order to be able to oppose fresh troops to fresh, or with such to overcome those that are exhausted. But it is not so in strategy. Partly, as we have just shown, it has not so much reason to fear a reaction after a success realized, because with that success the crisis stops. Partly all the forces strategically employed are not necessarily weakened. Only so much of them have been tactically in conflict with the enemy's force, that is, engaged in partial combat, are weakened by it. Consequently, only so much as unavoidably necessary, but by no means all which was strategically in conflict with the enemy, unless tactics has expended them unnecessarily. Corps which, on account of the general superiority in numbers, have either been little or not all engaged, whose presence alone has assisted in the result, are after the decision the same as they were before, and for new enterprises as efficient as if they had been entirely inactive. How greatly such corps which thus constitute our excess may contribute to the total success is evident in itself. Indeed, it is not difficult to see how they may even diminish considerably the loss of the forces engaged in tactical conflict on our side. If, therefore, in strategy the loss does not increase with the number of the troops employed, but it is often diminished by it, and if, as a natural consequence, the decision in our favor is by that means the more certain, then it follows naturally that in strategy we can never employ too many forces, and consequently also that they must be applied simultaneously to the immediate purpose. But we must vindicate this proposition upon another ground. We have hitherto only spoken of the combat itself. It is the real activity in war, but man, time, and space, which appear as the elements of this activity, must at the same time be kept in view, and the results of their influence brought into consideration also. So, a very important chapter today, which we discussed just the first half. The second we will read and comment next time. But it says quite important, the definitions and clear delineations and separations of the relation between the forces employed and their vulnerability in many ways, and their further deployability for combat in later time, right? And this is very important because we observe that strategy and tactics in this regard tend to differ quite a lot, and we'll see how. So for Clausewitz, right, okay, assembly of forces in time, we have here to deal with a conception which in real life diffuses many kinds of illusory light. A clear definition and development of the idea is therefore necessary, and we hope to be allowed a short analysis. Right. War is the shock of two opposing forces in collision with each other, from which it follows as a matter of course that the stronger not only destroys the other but carries it forward with it in its movement. Right. So there is naturally not just the counterposition of forces, but the capability fundamentally to overwhelm and to push forward once you have strike and not just defeated the enemy, frankly. And this fundamentally admits of no successive action of powers, but makes the simultaneous application of all forces intended for the shock appear as primordial law of war. Right. So as we've seen in the first book, this is the ideal. Right. This is the in fact, properly the primordial law of war. Right. This idea of two forces clashing in no real even physical environment, just literally playing iron arm and determining who's the strongest in this sense. And von Clausewitz then writes, so it is in reality in the sense that this is what war extrapolated from reality would work like, logically speaking. But von Clausewitz then writes, only so far as the struggle resembles also in practice a mechanical shock, right? That is to say, even in reality, this proper truth of how war works, descending into it, assumes this character. But as much as the clash becomes this kind of mechanical shock, and it is literally one force clashing, ideally one against the other, just in all its devoid of restraint, right? In this idea of absolute employ of violence, that, however, we have seen also in the previous context that never quite happens. That is always diluted, is always dispersed in a way or another. So the things grow very, very differently when, von Clausewitz says, it consists in a lasting mutual action of destructive forces, and then we can certainly imagine a successive action of forces, right? We have seen in the second book how war is never waged continuously, that within a campaign there are certain moments of actual rest, of suspension of the military action proper, right? That serve, in fact, to recover from all of these difficulties that oblige, as we've seen here, violence to be suspensed, right? Action, force to be, interrupted in the way it's delivered. And therefore, we can see this kind of as scattered impulses that lighten up every once in a while, according to a logic of this, definitely, in this overall collision, right, of a struggle between the two forces, but that are intermittently used, right, and to, of course, to gain the greater advantage at the moment of combat probe. So when they're clashing directly. And von Clausewitz says this is the case in tactics, principally because firearms form the basis of all tactics, but also for other reasons as well. So von Clausewitz here introduces the tactical perspective of how this is the case, right? He makes this example that actually is very simple, and now we see how it's articulated. It says, in a fire combat, 1,000 men are opposed to 500, right? So 2 to 1. And the gross loss is calculated from the amount of the enemy's force and our own. 1,000 men fire twice as many shots as 500, but more shots will take effect on the 1,000 than the 500, because it is assumed that they stand in closer order than the other, right? So naturally, this is a kind of a abstracted concept, but it shows to real elements, for the sake of the example, that is to say, more people shooting at the same time have a higher volume of fire, right? And at the same time, however, the more troops are concentrated, because we assume here that the mass is maintained as a principle, but it could also be otherwise. But tendentially, we've seen in previous chapters from this one now how important that concentration of forces really is. And therefore, with firearms, let's say it's easier to essentially by shooting in the midst of lots of people to hit, right, more than the forces are more scattered or less, right? So von Clausewitz writes, if we were to suppose that it's completely abstract here for the sake of indicating however factor can intervene, the number of hits to be double, right? So we bring this equation to say, let's imagine ideally that the concentration of troops increases the hitability, let's say, let's put it in this way, of themselves as target from the other side. The losses on each side would be equal, right? It's supposing that this was double, right? That is to say that the numbers concentrated determined in a directly proportional way the hit ratio, right? And This is purely ideal, but still in reality, this thing is of the higher hit ratio, given higher concentration of forces, is actually true, right? It's not directly proportional to the numerical strength of forces, but it definitely has to do with their concentration, with the order, with the theory, with lots of other things. So that this is why it's abstracted, but it's at least a thing. So for Clausewitz says, let's suppose it's equal, conversely 2 to 1, right? So as a consequence, he writes, from the 500 there would be, for example, 200 disabled, and out of the body of 1000 likewise the same, right? So they essentially, even if the numerical they're shooting, two rifles are shooting against one, still those two shooters concentrated are, let's suppose, twice as more likely hittable target than the single guy shooting from the other side. So these two bodies suffer in absolute terms, ideally, the same amount of losses, right? So now if the 500 had kept another body of equal number quite out of fire, then both sides would have 800 effective men. But of these, on the one side there would be 500 men quite fresh, fully supplied with ammunition and in their full vigor. On the other side there would be only 800, all alike shaken in their order, in want of sufficient ammunition and weakened in physical force. So here from Clausewitz, and you understand what his method is here, his dialectic is here he is absolutely, see, the average person comes reading this stuff, says, this guy is believing that, I don't know, if you have twice as many troops as the enemy, you're going to be hit twice more likely. No, he's just making an example, showing you, in this case, that what the concept of reserve is really meant for, and what difference it can make, and it does make, right? It doesn't say by how much quantitatively, but it's a real presence, right, as a factor in combat. Even over the troops that have been in combat. This is the purpose of reserve, a gradual effort. The idea is that allow you not to spend all your forces immediately. And why? Right? Because this is not just an iron arm. This has to do also with, as we've seen, this intermitting employment of force that can wait for, let's say, a better moment for whichever factor has interplayed at that point. And one of these has to do definitely, however, properly with combat in itself. That is to say, even if in practice those 500 versus 1000 are going to be wiped out, because that higher hit ratio will not compensate for that, for the superiority of fire volume. Still, you would have at that point 800 men versus 500, right? So assuming even in this situation that you would that is abstract, right? That we give for granted that there have been those 200 losses, right? And that, however, from both sides, but however your other forces, of 500 has melted away in front of the 1000. So you're remained with 500 men, right? The others are basically routing against 800. 800, however, that albeit having won, they have also shot, they have been marched, they are tired, they are shaken, they are more disordered, right? And therefore, you can't really have an advantage in this regard. And von Clausewitz therefore writes, the assumption that 1000 men merely on account of their greater number would lose twice as many as 500 would have lost in their place is certainly not correct, right? Okay, this is what also the point he was making, that is, this is abstract, right? It's obvious that, if you have that 2 to 1, we've seen it in the chapter on numbers, that in the practice of warfare, quite rarely, for example, from Clausewitz's times, the armies had won in conditions of half of numerical inferiority of 1 to 2, right? So we know this is not the case, von Clausewitz says. Then he writes, therefore the greater loss which the side suffers that has placed the half of its force in reserve must be regarded as a disadvantage in the original formation. So in this initial phase, the 1000 would, however, defeat the 500. Right? But now, what are these two advantages, he says, are a counterpoise to the disadvantage of finding ourselves with 800 men to a certain extent disorganized by the combat, opposed to an enemy who is not materially weaker in numbers and who has 500 quite fresh troops, is one that cannot be decided by pursuing an analysis further. We must here rely upon experience, and there will be scarcely an officer experienced in war who will not, in the generality of cases, assign the advantage to the side which has the fresh troops. That is to say, as always, there is no numerical ratio that we can claim to be alone satisfactory in every situation for saying, this side will win or lose, right? But at the same time, if you look at military practice, we will not reach that same amount of losses most of the times because of that hit ratio story, right? Because of the concentration of the masses. But in case, however, this were true and reality grows closer to that in certain circumstances, well, those 800 men, right, even if they're more and still armed in a way, and orderly, and they're not broke, right? But if they were to fight against 500 quite fresh troops that have not shot, that have not disordered their ranks, that are not been wounded or not been shaken, well, in terms of military experience, really the practice shows that those 500 would have the upper hand, would have the better of the 800 that have already fought. This is the point at which the concept of reserve is built, right? That, of course, there are other factors that you have to exploit in order to bring to this disadvantage to this numerical disadvantage to be overcome, right? Even in the military practice, where this usually is a good ratio, in the ratio that this usually current military practice not allowing you actually to win, but that this is exactly what the employment of reserves should be thought like, right? To essentially disorder, tire, and weaken the enemy at a point that you can't compensate for the for the fact that the numerical inferiority that can be carried out in many ways. We've seen, for example, the element of surprise, the stratagems, right? And therefore, lots of other. I have a battle in mind right now from 1315, which actually would illustrate it pretty well, where all this happened in practice. Even in there wasn't much of a numerical difference after all, but still that makes the point of how in tactics there is a time dimension that cannot be ignored, that has to do with how forces have to be employed, in fact, step after step, and that is going to have a lasting impact on combat, because as we've seen here, those 800 men, even if they had emerged victorious against, or better, those 1,000 men emerging victorious against the 500, but have lost 200, would still fundamentally be a disadvantage for having fought, so for having carried out an action that lasted over time against 500 people who have not fought yet. So this is an important point. It sounds, I know, there is this element of saying, we must consider the double hit ratio in order to justify this mathematically, right? But this is not the point, mathematically speaking. We're not making it. We've seen it many times. There is no golden section of numerical proportions that makes you win or lose a fight by itself. It's an important aspect, but alone it's virtually influent. The point, though, is that at least for all the potential circumstances that can emerge, naturally the numerical ones are, as we've seen, possibly the most important ones after the moral dimension of the story. But this point is showing us that we may be wanting in tactics to consider that once you have employed one unit, this has lost a lot of its effectiveness and can therefore be more easily overwhelmed. As we'll see now, in strategy things work very, very differently. Von Clausewitz writes, in this way it becomes evident how the employment of too many forces in combat may be disadvantageous. Right? For whatever advantages the superiority may give in the first moment, we may have to pay dearly for in the next. So the point von Clausewitz is saying here is not saying, look, you should always be using reserves, right, and thinking of employing your forces gradually. But in tactics, this is something that objectively can allow you, to play more and better the game, given the circumstances that can arise. Right, the use of reserves is, historically speaking, you understand how dramatic importance it really is. Right, it's not always there. Right. But at the same time, it constitutes one of those fundamental elements you find, in a battle, yes, in another, no, right? And that evidently, when employed, has its own specific and important meaning. That is not everything, but it has to do, once again, with the context and with lots of other elements interplaying. But that is important because tactics allows you this temporary state of exhaustion of troops that can be definitely exploited as one of the most important elements of dynamics for weakening the enemy, because it encompasses fundamentally many aspects of the same dimension. It's about the order of the units. It's about in this case, of the ammo employed. Also, this is valid also in melee, actually, of properly the psychological dimension of the troops that have fought. And lots of other elements that are attached and blended in all this. But still, von Clausewitz is not saying, as we'll see now, that this should always be the point, because still in tactics you could technically bet everything on one single attack, let's say, concentrating all the forces together and therefore investing on the principle of mass to overwhelm the enemy immediately. So even if your troops at the end get disorderly and therefore dangerously weak at that point, still the enemy would be in route, and you really wouldn't mind at that point to counter anyone. Which is still also something you can't always say at a given moment. But at the same time, this is an important principle. The concentration on mass in tactics is, as we will see now, relatively less important than in strategy. Because it says, but this danger only endures, talking about the danger of the weakening of the units after combat, as long as the disorder, the state of confusion and weakness lasts, in a word, up to the crisis which every combat brings with it, even for the conqueror. Right? There is always a climatic moment of combat, which, if you're fighting in the first place, it's not because you're meeting someone who knows is gonna lose, right? So there's gonna be a struggle. There's gonna be a moment in which you lose control of most of what is going on, as most of the external things are by far out of control. So the risk is always there, as we have seen before, and it's always very high and not easy to reduce. But within the duration of this relaxed state of exhaustion, the appearance of a proportionate number of fresh troops is decisive. Right. So there is a proportion that is to be determined every time, but that bringing in fresh this new number of fresh troops can result decisive and should always be borne in mind. And Clausewitz says, but when this disordering effect of victory stops, and therefore only the moral superiority remains which every victory gives, then it's no longer possible for fresh troops to restore the combat. They would only be carried along in the general movement. A beaten army cannot be brought back to victory a day after by means of a strong reserve. Here we find ourselves at this source of a highly material difference between tactics and strategy that we'll see now. But the point here Clausewitz has made is that fundamentally when you break an enemy in combat, bringing other fresh troops in all of a sudden is not going to fix the fact that your own troops have been defeated, right? There is this sort of irreversibility that must always consider, in this sense probably, that if you are to make other troops entering combat during the battle, you have to make sure, as we have seen here, that they are proportionate to give this superiority over the enemy troops that have remained on the field. That is to say, you can't really rely on who has already been defeated in combat, right? It's very rare to see, like, usually there are many reconstructions of battles saying, maybe after the battle there were some, during combat there were troops that after having been broken in the first fight, they kind of regrouped and reformed somewhere. These things kind of happen, but at the same time, how effective they are for combat, right? It's really often not clear, and this is actually a military historical notion to realize that most of the times what they can do at that point is just maybe pursuing the enemy after it's broken by the other forces that were ready to fight on the field, right? And it's very rare for example, feigned flights. Those are very fascinating things because they show that, those guys routed like for fake, right? They faked that, and then but which kind of troops are they really, right? Usually either they are kind of lighter troops that do that as a business, that is hit and run tactics that are trained specifically to that, but it's rare to find like a full body of troops that is meant to hand-to-hand combat, to counter grips with the enemy face to face, that is defeated, then eventually comes back to battle to an effect, good at decisive factor. Most of the times, that's really mostly like something different. That is, that the feint flight is done to make the enemy believe that you have broken the enemy, but actually waiting for the fresh troops to kick in, like by surprise, like not making the enemy believe that there would be others. That is what you find way more often in warfare, right? And I know that I'm just thinking about Hastings, ever since I started making this example, because one of you would come up with that saying, yeah, the Normans first fled, and then they came back and defeated the Saxons. Well, yeah, but we basically don't even know what actually happened in that battle. So I don't think that we have a, kind of positive understanding of what happens, even in battles that just because they're famous like Hastings, or no, actually we will make, of course, a video on Hastings at some point, but the reality of the logic of combat formations and this economy of forces, after all, is too often tied to the logic that, once that one unit is spent, there's really not much you can do about it to come back to fight as readily as it was. This might be part actually of the tactical plan, right? The idea that you want to sacrifice a unit to really eventually let the others have enough energies to defeat the enemy, right? The word tactics based, coming back to the Middle Ages, we deal with a lot, that it was to pick some kind of suicidal elite units to throw against the enemy and cause as many losses as possible at the very beginning of the battle, and then trying to exploit the consequences in there. And this gets very interesting, especially when there is a kind of a symmetric the tactical system that at that point try to really to cope with the same means in that. That's how it often happens, by the way. So aside from this, you understand what the implications here are, and what von Clausewitz really gets to is, in fact, and that is very important indeed, is the material difference between tactics and strategy in this regard. Because in tactics there is always this balance. In tactics, the guy who has just fought is a person who's thirsty, who's exhausted physically speaking, who has muscle hate that is devastated psychophysically speaking, that has seen people torn apart, that is not going to function the way it should until he restores himself, he drinks, he eats, he sleeps, right? And that's something you can't do during the fight, if not in a minimal part, but especially at the unit level has no importance at all practically, because once again, when a unit is spent, unless it has kind of managed to disengage the enemy in a more or less orderly way, has maintained an order and a compactness, like maybe that can be used in another way, but there are indeed enormous difficulties in breaking that back to fight functionally in the first place. But let's step in this from tactics to strategy and see where the difference really lays here between the two, right? Tactics appears dramatically fragile in this context, right? In terms of forces involved, because Von Clausewitz writes, the tactical results, the results within the four corners of the battle, so literally, the battlefield as we know it, and before its close, lie for the most part within the limits of that period of disorder and weakness, right? In other words, what we think is the outcome of battle is literally what basically lays in this moment to which you cannot make the army recover strength. You need it to flee, right? Because battles end with a rout, one side, and or at least a retreat, but still in a way that for which troops are not capable of putting up another fight the next day, right? Because they are devastated, because that is something like getting into under a terrible pressure and destroying basically all the cohesion and the order and the means. Think about the wounded, think about the sheer loss of command, of the internal reference within the unit. I mean, it's utterly devastating, and that's even just in the best sense. That is a battle that is it's lost maybe, but you kind of managed to retreat, but still with great losses. Normally it's a rout. I mean, literally the army is wiped out. It doesn't have a physical consistency anymore, right? Everybody runs, and it doesn't exist as a unit. And consider that armies are always kind of wearing themselves out in a way. So there is in here a progression that, as we will see now, has to do, in fact, with not with the tactical dimension. That cannot happen in the tactical dimension. It happens in the strategical one. It happens away from the battlefield. It happens where you can regroup, when you can reorganize and put up another fight. That is starting another battle in another place, in another situation. And Von Clausewitz, in fact, writes, but the strategic result, that is to say, the result of the combat, of the victories realized, the victories here meant as literally all the victories, I mean, all the result, the outcome of all combats that might have taken place everywhere along the front, let's say the war zone, let them be small or great, right, lies completely beyond, outside of that period, that is the one of tactics, right? It is only when the results of partial combats have bound themselves together into an independent whole that the strategic result appears. But then the state of crisis is over. The forces have resumed their original form and are now only weakened to the extent of those actually destroyed and is placed hors de combat. So, in other words, what does this mean? It means that you basically do not have an outcome of a battle until this doesn't transform once again in the control that you have on the troops, if any of them has remained, from the strategical point of view. That is to say, when you're able to regroup these troops and to use them again for another fight, right, that at that point must be disposed, right, and here, by definition, we have entered the domain of strategy, right? So, in other words, strategy is not dealing with that moment of crisis where, troops are out of control in many ways. They're of no use. They're depleted. They're worn out. Psychophysically, you can't make use of them. No, strategy employs them once they are gathered once again. They're reorganized, and they can't be sent in another fight, right? So, as a consequence, as we will see now, right, is that strategy basically doesn't know that status of crisis, right? You can have after a major defeat, the commander freaks out and says, you know what, we're out of here, let's retreat somewhere and we're still frankly in the realm of strategy. But at that point, maybe it's the state that begins to collapse, the society that begins to collapse, that is not able to keep the troops anymore. Think about, I don't know, the Russians in 1917. And how the revolutions actually in 1917 broke out in Russia. They had much to do with the outcome of war, but in this sense, how the Russian army melted away on the Eastern Front, the Tsarist army melted away, is something that had to do with what was happening at home, right, and not properly, the military dimension of the story. That, of course, was influenced the other in turn, but you understand what the point that I'm making. That strategy, as long as it is in command of its armed forces, it is properly not facing the crisis, because the war can be lost, right, but you still be in control of the troops. Think about the same Eastern Front, but not even 30 years after that, in 1945. Think about the Nazis that kept fighting in Berlin. Everything was lost, but as long as they had control of those units, they kept using them, and they decided to die in there. And the thing there, it shows you brilliantly how until eventually those units weren't wiped out, so they were physically destroyed, strategy, in this sense, didn't know a status of crisis. They knew they were going to lose. But the state of crisis, as long as you have a functional unit with people who are, fed, equipped, armed, etc., doesn't exist, because you can't spend that. How, once again, politics and society interplays with this is fundamental. But here we're talking in the Clausewitzian theory just from the military point of view. So it's obvious that those troops had not been, National Socialist fanatics, or people brought by the same Nazis as on the point of the bayonet to fight to the death, even children and and old people. That wouldn't make sense. But from a specifical strategic point of view, there was no crisis in there. Right, the situation it sucked. They had lost everything, but still, the crisis happens only when you get an entire company wiped out by Katyusha fire. That this is the concept we're making proper. So there is this very plastic transition proper that you can see in the Clausewitzian theory between how the outcome of combat on the battlefield in a tactical dimension passes into is literally collected by this and properly provided with meaning by the strategic dimension that will have what to do, if it has the means, of course, to make use of the same armed forces at that point. But that doesn't know that crisis that only tactics faces in this regard, when the troops are shattered. What's the point, especially with the example of the 1,500 soldiers we were making before? That is why, we'll see this now better, that while in tactics you can think properly of a succession of struggles that will essentially lower the functionality of the troops involved. Well, in strategy, there is not this, right? Because you can get, of course, a tired army, but still, if the army works, if the army marches, if that doesn't melt away, it's still something you have there. It has to do eventually with the moral forces, whether it's going to be motivated or not, that is going to have an importance in the fight. whatever. But as long as you have units you can dispose of, you don't know that crisis. This is very different in combat. This is different in tactics. Because in tactics, you're under certain forces, certain strengths that can knock you out and that properly have a lasting impact on you, on your functionality, and that can be exploited by the enemy easily, as we have seen. In this gradual exertion of forces. In strategy, it's really not like that. Because even if you suffer devastating defeat all over a front, you still can't have intact units to retreat. Well, those are still functional units. Doesn't matter that their morale is shattered. As long as you keep them in order, marching, equipped, they're ready for the next battle, in which maybe they will suck, because still, they will be demotivated and whatever, but they still exist as actual armed forces. In tactics, the thing at least swings much more wildly, right? And von Clausewitz writes, in fact, the consequence of this is that tactics can make a continued use of forces, strategy only a simultaneous one. What does this mean? It means that strategy doesn't have this idea of, now I will use reserves, right? There is no proper reserve in terms of qualitative swing of the armed forces during their employment, right? The strategic units that are on the front, they're fighting. As long as they are there, they exist. They are as good as theoretically the ones that are waiting behind the front line, right? Because they are meant to function as a unit proper. That as long as it's there, it's waiting for the next attack. It's not wiped out. It works. It's of its disposal. So basically, there is no, now the functionality of this unit is more or less because I have employed it here instead than there, or before instead than after, right? You will say, what about logistics, right? What about units that, have been in front line and tired and exhausted? Yes, but that is not a military dimension. That has to do with how much you can serve these troops, and here von Clausewitz has to do with the merely military, the art of war proper, that doesn't contemplate the logistical element. It is not a properly part of it, right? That is what the general does when the troops are ready to fight, and how to employ it, right? And here, this should be connected to much else. That is to say that even the individual devastation of a soldier, even if it was proper of many others, still when it, you rise through the ranks and you see what the whole unit, the greater units are really about, you see that they tend not to show that, right? An army has this military virtue that, of course, can, depending on its intensity, can make the unit more or less effective. But at the same time, armies still function as armies. Like, there is not a properly military character that makes a unit less of a unit unless this literally melts away, right? This is the point von Clausewitz is made. So while in tactics you should be evaluating technically this immediate expandability of the troops' resources in the combat, in strategy you really don't give a damn about it. There is not this sequence, right? In strategy you use units as they are. You don't have to worry about that. You can't worry in the sense that you may know exactly what their strength is, but whether they have marched 1 day or 10 days, if your supply lines works and everything, that doesn't make it different, right? I know this is kind of a subtle concept. I don't know how fully I'm able to explain it to you in this regard, but von Clausewitz exactly makes this point here and doesn't, now as we will see, develops the concept further, but doesn't remain it more than much, right? He writes, if I cannot in tactics decide all by the first success, if I have to fear the next moment, it follows of itself that I employ only so much of my force for the success of the first moment as appears sufficient for that object, and keep the rest beyond the reach of fire or conflict of any kind, in order to be able to oppose fresh troops to fresh, or with such to overcome those that are exhausted. Right? In tactics, I have to worry about this. I have to worry whether I have already spent my unit before. In strategy, von Clausewitz writes, it is not so. Partly, as we have just shown, it has not so much reason to fear a reaction after a success realized, because with that success the crisis stops. Partly, all the forces strategically employed are not necessarily weakened. Right? So you may have units that are depleted, who are, surely under strength most of the times, and may have issues with other problems of logistics, of how they are supplied and so on. But that is not the problem of the military art probe. The problem of the military art is saying, okay, I have troops that are, now reorganized, equipped enough to go to the next fight. Fine. That's how I'm going to employ them, right? And I will have to consider the specific way, but not really making it much of a fuss about it, because in proportion it's not that relevant. In tactics, I have to worry about that. Von Clausewitz writes, only so much of them as have been tactically in conflict with the enemy's force, that is, engaged in partial combat, are weakened by it. Consequently, only so much as was unavoidably necessary, but by no means all which was strategically in conflict with the enemy, unless tactics has expanded them unnecessarily. Corps which, on account of the general superiority in numbers, have either been little or not at all engaged, whose presence alone has assisted in the result, are after the decision of the same as they were before, and for new enterprises as efficient as if they had been entirely inactive. Right? In strategy, you can't say, okay, I will send in these divisions. Right? It doesn't matter if they are, less, effective than others. The importance is that I can deploy them. Then how that they will perform in combat is a problem strategy of tactics, But in strategy, they essentially are deployable, and they can be invested in combat before or after with no timely dimension in this sense that really makes a difference, probe. Right? Time here, this whole thing here is about concentration of forces by time, right? If I just on a front line keep pouring divisions, let's say, that is fine, right? And if I put them en masse, it's fine. Just simply increase the force. In tactics, that, as we've seen, may be a problem, because if I spend them all at once, I have at least to make sure that there are no other factors that may revert the situation, because it turns out that the fuel of my troops, what makes them really be effective, can be spent very, very, very easily. In the strategical dimension, this is not the case, right? Because it probably has not to do with the tactical dimension by definition, right? In this at this dispositional level of how that they're going to be employed. The matter here is how many troops you can engage in succession, right? Without minding about their previous state, right? How, from Clausewitz writes, how greatly such corps which thus constitute our excess may contribute to the total success is evident in itself. Indeed, it's not difficult to see how they may have diminished, even diminished considerably the loss of forces engaged in tactical conflict on our side. Right? That is to say that tactics, as we'll see now, is also a dimension in which, let's say, forces are more easily dispersed, even in actual material terms. We've seen it with the losses before, right? The capacity to break, to really be wiped out at a tactical level are much higher to be done on a strategical one. Strategical one can still keep things in order, even one unit after he has been wiped out. Right. In the tactical dimension, there is properly the physical annihilation, physical destruction. Right. In a strategical level, a sector troops they're very easy to surround them in many ways. Right. To leave pockets that are surrounded or fight to death. Why? Because if they're surrounded, they're not losing their cohesion. They're simply units that are standing in one place and waiting for the inevitable. If that happens on a battlefield, those units are simply to melt away on the spot, because they know they're going to be butchered from a second to another, not from one day to another. So this is a really big difference, right? That is really felt quantitatively between the strategical and the tactical dimension, and it is never to be underestimated in this scale of effective tactics and strategy, as in all their connection that definitely does exist. You can't treat a battle as you treat a front line in this regard. And von Clausewitz says, if therefore in strategy the loss does not increase with the number of troops employed, right, but is often diminished by it, and if as a natural consequence the decision in our favor is by that means the more certain, then it follows naturally that in strategy we can never employ too many forces, and consequently also that they must be applied simultaneously to immediate purpose. What does this mean? It means that while in tactics the more people I put in combat at the moment, therefore I concentrate troops, massive troops in time, and I can have, and the more I will risk to see them wiped out easily. In strategy, actually, it's the other way around. In strategy, the more troops I bring in, the more units I bring in, and the more this is going to consolidate the whole picture, the whole scenario, and for me, and the losses will be contained, right? So this has a lot of important consequences, because you realize that if I, for instance, we have seen examples in even in the previous chapters, but the idea is that if I let a division isolated, this is going to be easily wiped out by, let's say, 2 enemy divisions. If instead this happened in tactics, at least the damage that, let's say instead of divisions, companies would really have in combat is that those 2 companies may easily overwhelm the single company, but they would suffer much more from it in the tactical dimension. So if I have another company that is not fighting but is waiting nearby and can intervene later, they will probably get much greater impact than if I, at a strategical level, I sent a division after the first one had been wiped out and crushing the other 2, because the other 2 have won against my own division before. At that point, they're still ready to fight once again, because they had the time and space and to be ready once again for combat, for a battle probe. So they have passed from the tactical dimension once again to the strategical one, intact, and are ready to fight once again. So this naturally should count how many troops were lost or whatever, but here this is not what Clausewitz is meant to observe. Here he really evidences how the vulnerability of units in the tactical level surpasses by far the one at the strategical one, right? And that therefore the employment of such units at a strategical and tactical level respectively varies a freaking lot, and the concentration of troops in time therefore is something much more convenient on average, strategically speaking, that it's not tactically, right? And on this these are general statements, but like Vom Kriege is built over this. As we often see, this is really looking at the swing between the extremes, right? And what we are trying to find here is what exists in the middle, given the average situation. This may not be true in certain situations, but most of the times it is. Right? This is what the military experience has showed us, and there are, Clausewitz has explained us up to this point in Vom Kriege why this is the case, why we actually get to the point of saying, in tactics the thing is much wilder. Yes, because it's in the tactical dimension you're being hammered by artillery, by machine gun fire. That is different from the strategical level, where you just dispose of these troops for combat, for the sake of combat, right? Functionally to combat. To combat it will happen at some point, but it doesn't happen at the moment, right? So this is naturally an understanding that there is not like a physical, like a timely or spatial dimension in which you're either in tactics or strategy. The two things always exist, right? They just manifest themselves in different moments in different ways at the same time. And that's how they also interplay. But the idea is that after a fight, you must, in order to fight again, you must revert back to strategy. And therefore, while you are in strategy, you have re-equilibrated the crisis. You may bring the scars with you. You may have, being weakened, whatever, all these things. But at that point, you're namely able to fight to go into battle once again. And therefore, you have surpassed that crisis from which you had, maybe come, not just as defeated, but as we have seen also as victorious armies after, the battle, are exhausted and vulnerable for this reason. And we will observe this also in other, in other contexts here. The Vom Kriege, how, other points of view, right? How this, for example, impacts how we have already touched this issue actually in the past. How, the pursuit or the encampment depend heavily even on this situation. And always remember, the victories are devastating, right? As it was Wellington, I think, after Waterloo, so that there's nothing more sad and to watch than after a battle lost than a battle won, right, on the field, right? I have to see what the price really is, and this has naturally an impact on the same winner in terms of losses, devastation, and it's really to be taken into account. That's why it's only after this re-equilibration that when the troops are ready to be sent fighting somewhere else, that you have properly come back into the strategical dimension when you can dispose of these troops, right? Because there is properly a dimension, strategically speaking, where you send troops in and you can't call them off, right? And they're into combat, and whatever thing is gonna go, you basically lost much of the control over them at that very moment, because they're fighting, and in that situation of crisis, you can't do much for really control. That's why you must have planned pretty damn well the thing before, and that's what strategy is meant to do, like in function of combat. Then after battle, whether it's been successful or not, you can come back into proper control of those units, because the crisis is past. But this is the important difference between strategy and tactics, how they operate on different levels after all. But they couldn't exist one without the other, because strategy is aimed at combat, and combat couldn't exist without strategical disposition of combat itself, right? And the meaning that eventually is attached, even just an expectation, and naturally after the battle is being consumed. And then for Clausewitz here, I just added the last phrase that has to do actually with the second half of the chapter we'll see next time, says, but now, because it's not over, of course, but we must vindicate this proposition upon another ground. We have hitherto only spoken of the combat itself. It is the real activity in war, but men, time, and space, which appear as the elements of this activity, must at the same time be kept in view, and the results of their influence brought into consideration also. So next time we will see, hopefully, how this, probably the human, timely, and spatial dimensions interfere with this, and why what we have described today is really the case. Anyhow, this is all for today. I don't know how effective I am once again to explain these things, but I think at least in the end we got it pretty clear, because after all it's much more intuitive than it seems as a concept. When you get it's very, the brilliancy of Von Clausewitz thought is based exactly in this natural way it really flows once you have collected all the data and you try to read them, right? It's a pleasure to read and study. And anyhow, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time. See you next time. Bye.